The Tarte Tatin is conceptually an extremely simple dessert. It's pastry with apples. I mean, that's apple pie, our most humble and ubiquitous dessert. But with Tarte Tatin, it's like they took the simplicity of the apple pie and used some advanced techniques to accidentally create something extremely elegant. And I do mean accidentally, because according to French pastry lore, it was created by the Tatin sisters at Hotel Tatin in France when they were baking an apple tart and realized they forgot the crust, which is a pretty big thing to forget. So their solution was to just add the crust on top. And that way, when it's done baking, they could flip it upright. I question that story because there's actually some good reasons to do it that way. Mainly, you get to introduce caramel, which goes so well with apples. But I'm very intrigued by this dessert, so I'm going to go step by step to make one now. And I think I have the perfect beer to pair with it. Orval is one of the few breweries in the world with the Trappist designation because it's actually brewed at a Trappist monastery. Out of all the Trappist beers, I think that Orval might be one of my favorites, which, to be honest with you, makes it a front runner to be my favorite beer of all time. We'll find out if it makes a good pairing after I bake my Tarte Tatin on this episode of Bacon and Brew. We'll start by making our pastry. The original likely used a short crust pastry, but many modern variations use a puff pastry, which is what I'm doing today. I'll mix 300 grams of all-purpose flour with half a teaspoon of salt. And then add about 150 milliliters of ice-cold water, just adding a little at a time until I get the consistency I want. I'm looking for a relatively wet dough, but I don't want it to be too sticky. Once everything comes together, I'll generously flour my countertop and just knead it a little bit by hand until everything comes into a nice tight ball. I'll put that in the refrigerator for at least 30 minutes while I work on my butter block. And now I'll place a 227 gram block of European style butter between two sheets of parchment paper. By the way, I'm not being pretentious when I specify European style butter. There is a good reason for that. Butter isn't 100% fat, there is some moisture in there as well, and European standards require butter to be at least 82% fat, and in America we don't have that regulation. To make any pastry that involves laminating layers, you need that fat. So it is acceptable to use American style butter, just make sure you use a brand that specifies that it is at least 82% fat. And we need to flatten out this block of butter any way possible, and violently bashing it with a rolling pin seems perfectly effective. And I'll roll that with a rolling pin to make a nice even layer. I'll put this butter back in the refrigerator because keeping it cold is of utmost importance throughout this process. Once everything had a long cold rest, I'll take out my dough and roll it into a large shape that somewhat resembles a square. You're going to want it to be at least big enough to wrap around your entire butter block. Once that's flattened out, I'll place my butter block right in the middle and fold the corners over. We want to make sure there's no butter peeking out because the butter is what's going to keep the layers of our pastry separated. And don't worry if it isn't perfectly rectangular. We're going to end up doing a lot of folds on this, so it'll get there eventually. And we're going to do our first fold right away. Roll it out so it's nice and long, and we'll do a letter fold, which is basically folding it in thirds. Fold one end 2/3 up, and take the other end and fold it down. And this will go back in the refrigerator to let it rest again. After I had another long rest in the fridge, we're going to do another letter fold. Roll it out, and then fold it into thirds. We're going to continue repeating this process until we have a total of 6 letter folds. You could try to do a second fold each time, but once your dough starts to warm up and feel the slightest buttery, put it back in the refrigerator. If the butter gets too warm, it'll start mixing with the flour and ruin your layers. And many recipes recommend bypassing this entire process and just buying frozen puff pastry crusts. and then back in the refrigerator until we're ready for it. Now we'll move on to our apples. I'm using a blend of Pink Lady and Honeycrisp, but use any variety of your choice. You will want to use a variety that holds its shape while cooking, which I'm not an apple expert, so I can't really tell you which one's which. I'm going to prepare 9 total. I don't know if I'll use everything. After peeling, I'll cut it into quarters. And then cut the core out. You may notice that I left a little skin on the ends of some of them. That was my mistake. I should have cut the top and the bottom of the apples off as well. So I did have to go back and get that later. And in a big bowl, I'm going to mix the apples with 50 grams of sugar, a pinch of salt, and a squeeze of lemon. I'll mix that by hand. And pour it all into a baking tray. I'm going to give these apples a head start in a 400-degree oven for about 30 minutes. While those are baking, I'll go back to my puff pastry so we could shape this into its final form. I'll roll this out to about 1/4 inch in thickness. I'm going to bake the Tarte Tatin in a cast iron skillet, so I'm just going to use that as a guide. We're going to want it to be big enough to overhang just a little bit so we could tuck the edges in. And then I'll cut off the excess. I'll place a piece of plastic wrap over it and put it back in the refrigerator until I'm ready for it. Meanwhile, I'll make the caramel. I'll pour 150 grams of granulated sugar directly into the same skillet I plan on baking my Tarte Tatin. Now you could mix this with water as well. It will give you a little more control and the water will just evaporate off. But I'm going to see how I do going straight into the pan. I'll put it on low heat and just wait for the sugar to slowly melt. Now you don't want to stir while making caramel because that could cause the sugar to crystallize. Although given that you're baking it afterwards, I don't necessarily think you would ruin a dish if you do. But I'm just going to gently move the pan around to let the caramel mix. And I'm starting to form one hot spot, so I'm just going to tilt the pan slightly to get some of that sugar to move around. And it's looking kind of clumpy, so I'm starting to regret not dissolving it in water first and letting that water evaporate. But with a little patience and slowly moving the pan around, I eventually got it all melted and it picked up that really nice amber color. And obviously you don't want to go too dark with the caramel, because the darker you make it, the more bitter it's going to get. So you want that balance between adding flavor and still retaining some of the sweetness of the sugar. And once you're happy with it, turn off the heat and add 55 grams of butter, which would stop the caramelization process. And at this point it is okay to stir. And we'll mix that up until we get a nice thick caramel. And now that our apples are out of the oven and softened up a bit, I'm going to place them directly on top of the caramel. I'll start by lining them around the outside. I'll pack those in as tight as I can, and then I'll start lining them around the middle. And of the 9 apples I've peeled, I've got 8 of them in there. And now I'll place that puff pastry disc right on top. I'm going to want to work fairly quickly at this point, because since the apples and the caramel are still fairly hot, that butter in the pastry is going to start to melt. So I want to get this in the oven as soon as I can. I'll try to tuck the sides under the apples, tuck it in there really tight. Remember that since this is technically the bottom, We're going to need it to contain the apples once we flip it right side up. I'll use my spatula just to really get it down in there. And then I'll cut a few vents on top of it just to let the steam out as it bakes. And then into a 400-degree oven for 35 to 40 minutes. And it actually looks really good now. The crust is golden brown and flaky, but we're missing that great presentation of the caramelized apples, which means we're going to have to let it cool for at least 30 minutes to an hour. And now the moment of truth. If you've watched my other videos, you may have seen me remake a couple items, but this one was quite tedious, so I really hope I get this one the first time. It'll be a real shame for me to put in all that time and not stick the landing. If it does stick to the bottom of the pan, you could always throw the skillet back on the stovetop just to remelt the caramel. But after a couple taps, it fell right out. You've heard the term golden brown and delicious before, but this whole thing is soaked in caramel. And I think the best bite of this whole thing is those puff pastry edges that just soak up that caramel sauce. And of course we're going to pair it with some Orval, the classic Trappist ale, and a dollop of creme fraiche. Of course a scoop of vanilla ice cream would also be appropriate, but you already knew that. Orval is basically the kind of beer that a brewer would make if they could only brew one beer for the rest of their lives. Because that's essentially what they did. This is the only beer that Orval releases publicly. Even other Trappist beers could have a double, triple, a quadruple, but at Orval, it's just Orval. So if I only had one beer to brew for the rest of my life, I wouldn't want one ingredient to dominate. I would want all the ingredients to work in harmony. And that's what Orval does that's so brilliant. They actually dry hop this beer, which is usually a technique reserved for the more assertive IPAs. But they do it in a way where the hops don't dominate the aroma. Same thing with yeast strain. A lot of Belgian ales have a strong bubblegum, banana aroma. The primary yeast used for Orval just gives it a lighter fruit ester. And the malt, they obviously use a little bit of specialty malt in there, given the amber color, but the beer is not cloying at all. And I think the most brilliant addition that Orval makes is the secondary yeast strain called Brettanomyces that they add at bottling. Brettanomyces is a wild yeast, usually associated with funky and sour beers, but those beers also get additional character from bacteria such as lactobacillus that actually make the beer sour. Brettanomyces on its own provides an interesting leathery, freshly cut hay aroma, characters that some would describe as barnyardy, which sounds interesting for a beer, but that's what makes it pair so brilliantly with apples, because I could just picture myself in an apple orchard having this pairing together. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll leave you with some bonus rage bait of me using soap to wash my cast iron skillet.